In the desolate plains of Utah, a mute 7-year-old girl stands between a shackled horse and the foster father who once saved her. No words, no tears, just a fierce gaze, and the sound of a single bell cutting through the night. This isn't just a rescue of a horse, it's a battle to reclaim her stolen voice. Subscribe now to follow our powerful, emotional, and healing cinematic stories. The field stretched for miles in every direction, golden and dry under the Utah dusk. The wind blew sideways across the flatlands, bending the brittle grass in long, tired waves. Standing motionless in the center was a small girl with copper-blonde hair tangled by the wind, her pale hands loose by her sides. Her name was Ava Thorne. She was 7 years old, and she hadn't spoken in almost a year. The silence around her was complete, eerie in its stillness. But inside her, there was noise. A hum she couldn't name. A buzzing deep beneath the bones. Her eyes, blank and wide, stared straight ahead, but they weren't seeing the field. They were seeing something else entirely. Something that lived behind her eyelids now. Flash, a scream, metal twisting, glass exploding into stars. Flash, her mother's face slumped over the steering wheel. Blood streaked across her cheek. The woman's necklace, a crescent moon, hung broken in Ava's lap. Ava's small hands shook as she touched her mother's arm. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Flash, smoke coiling into the sky like a question, then black. The field returned. Ava blinked, slow and empty. The wind tugged at the hem of her shirt. The last pink thread of daylight slipped under the horizon like a secret. And far in the distance, a hawk cried once before vanishing into the silence again. A white truck idled nearby, engine ticking. The man inside leaned over to open the passenger door. "Come on, Ava," he said, voice low, rough. He didn't raise it. He never did. She turned her head. Dr. Caleb Thorne was in his early 50s, lean, upright, military bearing stitched into the way he stood, the way he moved, the way he even breathed. His silver-gray hair was cropped short. His boots were spotless. His face was hard, square-jawed, carved from the same stone as the desert that surrounded them. But his eyes, they were like frost. Not cruel, not warm, just remote. He stepped down from the truck and held out a hand. Ava didn't take it. She climbed into the passenger seat by herself. No words, no glances. The two drove in silence for over an hour deeper into the wild. No towns, no lights, no questions. Just the growing darkness and the occasional crunch of gravel under tire. Caleb glanced at her only once, long enough to notice the way her knees were pulled up to her chest, her forehead against the glass, fogging it with shallow breath. "She's a quiet one," the social worker had said, "since the accident. She'll need time." Time. Caleb didn't believe in time. He believed in precision, structure, control. When they finally reached the property, a vast, rugged tract of land outside Moab, Ava didn't react. The place was a former Army medical outpost, repurposed into a sprawling ranch house years ago. The wood was sun-bleached and cracked, the fence lines rusted. In the rear was a barn, half swallowed by sagebrush, and beyond that, flat, empty country leading to red cliffs and silence. Caleb led her inside. "Your room's upstairs. Bathroom across the hall. Kitchen closes at 8. He didn't say welcome. He didn't touch her shoulder. He just turned on his heel and disappeared into his study. Ava stood in the middle of the hallway, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Faint smells lingered, old books, dried leather disinfectant. The walls had no pictures. The windows had no curtains. There was no television, no radio. Just ticking clocks in every room, military time. She climbed the stairs alone, the wood creaking beneath her weight like it resented being woken. Her bedroom was sparse. A narrow bed with a heavy wool blanket. A desk, a single lamp. A window that looked out into darkness. She didn't cry. She didn't change. She just lay down, still fully dressed, her sneakers hanging off the edge of the bed. Her hands clutched the hem of her shirt, and her wide eyes stared at the ceiling fan above her, motionless, dusty still. She fell asleep without blinking. Sometime deep into the night, the wind began to shift. The air in the room grew colder, heavier. The fan above her creaked once, then began to spin slowly, without power. And then she heard it. A sound, low, ragged breathing. It wasn't human. It came in waves, almost like a heartbeat, then faster, then again. In the dream, she was no longer in her bed. She was somewhere underground. The walls were concrete, stained and damp. Water dripped in the distance. Her feet were bare wet against the floor. A faint red light flickered overhead like a dying eye. And in the corner, something moved. A massive shadow hunched, breathing. Then two eyes blinked open. Not human. Horse, but wrong. It was black as coal when its skin shimmered like it had been dipped in oil and fire. Its mane was tangled, scorched. On its forehead, just between its eyes, was a burn mark seared in the shape of a flame. A raw, cracked wound that glowed red with each exhale. It was chained heavy iron running from its legs to the wall behind it. Breathing hard, its body twitching in pain. But its eyes weren't animal. They were pleading. Then it raised its head and looked straight at her. And in her dream, Ava stepped forward. The chains rattled. The breathing stopped. Then a scream, but not from the horse, from Ava, and she woke up. She sat upright in bed, sweat soaking her collar. The lamp beside her flickered once, though no one had turned it on. The ceiling fan was still spinning slowly, ticking like a metronome. She looked toward the window. The glass had fogged in a strange circular pattern, even though the room was cold. She got out of bed, walked to the desk, pulled open the drawer. Inside, chalk, the kind they used in field labs for incident diagrams. She took a piece, white. Then she walked to the window. The glass was still fogged. Her fingers trembled, but she reached up and began to draw. A circle, then two long ears, a curved neck. And then she pressed hard with sudden force an eye. And in the center of the forehead, a jagged mark shaped like fire. She finished, then stepped back. The moonlight slipped in behind the clouds, and the chalk lines on the glass lit up like they'd been carved, not drawn. The horse stared back at her through the lines. She stood still, not breathing. Then slowly she reached forward and placed her hand on the drawing's forehead, right over the flame. A warmth spread through her palm, and somewhere far beneath the floorboards, something shifted. Chains moved. The fan stopped, and Ava finally blinked. Downstairs in his study, Caleb was poring over old documents. Military records, medical files, a map of the property with certain areas marked in red. He heard the creak of wood above him, then silence. He paused. His fingers hovered over the page. He turned his head just slightly, listening, then shook it off. He went back to the file. On the folder was a label. Operation FireMark, decommissioned, 2007. His hand moved across it, tracing something underneath the paper. A scratch. A name carved faintly into the desk. It read Isabel T. He stopped, closed the folder, looked up. Outside the window, a faint flicker of movement. The drawing on Ava's window glowed red again. Then darkness, full, silent, except in the distance, barely audible. The cry of a horse, but it sounded too human to be real. Mornings came cold in Moab, even under a desert sun. The wind scraped across the tin roof like dry fingernails. Inside the house, the clocks ticked like a courtroom, measured, final, indifferent. Ava awoke without expression. She didn't stretch. She didn't yawn. She simply sat up. Her eyes stared out the small window where the chalk drawing from the night before had already begun to fade under morning frost. She touched the glass where the flame had been. Nothing. Just cold. Downstairs, Caleb Thorne was already moving his boots, echoed in perfect tempo across the hardwood. He cooked silently, oatmeal black coffee. He didn't call her down. He never did. By the time Ava entered the kitchen, he was halfway through the newspaper, hands gloved in calloused quiet. She sat. Her spoon clinked once against the bowl. "You've got chores after breakfast," he said, not looking up. "The pump shed needs cleaning." She nodded. He didn't see it. There was no music in the house, no laughter, no past. Ava chewed slowly, her eyes lingering on the ceiling, where a crack in the plaster traced the shape of a bird in flight. Her fingers moved under the table's silent motions, fluid as breath. She had started signing again, even if only to herself. But Caleb didn't understand sign. He didn't ask to. The days passed like that. Wordless, waited. Ava made her own routines. She swept the front porch. She refilled the horse troughs, though no horses had lived here in years. She read silently books from the attic, old field manuals and veterinary guides. She copied diagrams of tendons and muscle groups, studied pictures of hooves and bridles. But more than anything, she watched the barn. It sat like a dead lung on the edge of the property, half collapsed on one side. Its door chained shut, its shadow long and jagged in the evenings. Caleb never went near it, and neither did she. Yet, instead she studied him. Every evening at 1700, sharp Caleb entered the side paddock, stripped off his overshirt, and began to train. Pull-ups on the old crossbeam, deadlifts with sandbags, movements sharp, precise, military. His body still held the language of war, calculated, pain-chosen silence, and his eyes, whenever they flicked toward Ava, cold as the barrels he used to clean. She tried once, 2 weeks after arriving, to offer him a note. She had written, "Do you want to learn sign language?" on a napkin. He hadn't even looked at it. Just crumpled it, tossed it toward the trash, and missed. He picked it up 2 hours later, quietly, but said nothing. It was 3 days after the dream when Mrs. Dorsey arrived. Ava was sitting beneath the tree, out back legs tucked beneath her, drawing the shape of a horse's eye in the dirt. She was using a twig curved like a knuckle bone, carving slow circles into the earth. A soft rustle of gravel made her look up. Mrs. Dorsey walked with a limp, slight but permanent. Her frame was thin, wire-tough, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Around her throat, a scarf covered a visible surgical scar, pale against sun-worn skin. She didn't speak. She simply smiled, warm and deliberate. In her hands, she held a gift, a tiny brass bell, old, scratched but still gleaming. Ava tilted her head, curious. Mrs. Dorsey bent down slowly until they were eye level. Then she pointed at her own lips, then shook her head. No voice. Ava blinked, then slowly pointed to her own throat. Also no voice. They stared at each other, recognizing. Then Mrs. Dorsey held up the bell and rang it once. Ding! The sound was pure clean, like light made audible. Then she took Ava's small hand and placed the bell inside it. No words, just the weight of something chosen. If you want to say something, her eyes seemed to say, you can ring this. Ava held it for a long moment, then curled her fingers around it. Mrs. Dorsey reached up, tapped her own temple, then pointed to the barn in the distance. Her eyebrows raised as if to ask, you hear it too? Ava stiffened. Did she? Did someone else dream what she dreamed? But Mrs. Dorsey said no more. She just smiled, then turned and walked away, her cane clicking softly on the stone path behind her. Ava watched until she vanished into the horizon. That night the wind came back. Fiercer this time. It howled across the eaves and rattled the back window. The drawing had vanished entirely, now wiped clean by frost. Ava sat upright in bed, the bell in her hand, unmoving. She couldn't sleep. The air smelled different. Dusty, electrical. She sat up. The wind was calling. Something in it buried but urgent. She slid out of bed barefoot and crept toward the door. She didn't turn on the light. She moved by instinct. The hall creaked once. Caleb didn't stir. His door remained closed. She opened the front door with slow fingers. The night hit her like breath held too long. Cold, dry, alive. She stepped outside. The earth was rough beneath her feet, sharp with stone and broken weeds. But she kept walking. The bell dangled from her fingers, catching the moonlight like a talisman. She didn't know where she was going. She just followed the sound. It wasn't really a sound, though. It was deeper, lower. A hum that crawled into her ribs and stayed there. She passed the pump shed, past the dried-out water tank, until she reached the edge of the field. The stars overhead looked brittle, like they could shatter if she breathed too hard. And that's when she saw it. In the soil, not deep, just there, like it had risen from underneath. A rock, but not just any rock. It was large, half buried in the dirt. Charcoal black, too smooth, too rounded. It looked burned. She knelt beside it. Her fingers traced the surface. It was still warm, impossible. The night was freezing. She leaned closer, and there, carved into the stone, barely visible, was a shape. A flame, identical to the mark she had drawn in the window. Identical to the scar on the horse's forehead in her dream. Ava stared at it, her breath shallow. Then she closed her fingers around the bell. For a long moment she considered ringing it. She lifted it halfway, paused. The wind shifted again this time, toward her, carrying the scent of smoke and rust. Then, a single distant sound. Low, raspy, almost human. A breath. Ava turned toward the barn. Its roof jagged in the moonlight like broken teeth. Its doors unmoving. But behind it, behind the boards, and the dust, and the silence, something waited. She felt it, not saw, felt. The chain in her pocket clinked once, the small chain the bell had come with, and her fingers tightened around it. Then she stood. The wind died just for a second, as if holding its breath. She turned back toward the house. The night swallowed her shadow, and behind her, the rock pulsed once with heat, then cooled again. Inside the house, Caleb lay in bed, his hands folded on his chest. His eyes were open. He had heard the door. He had heard her footsteps, but he didn't move. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, then reached to the nightstand, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small metal case. Inside it, a photograph. Old, faded, a woman holding a newborn. On the back, in smeared ink, to Caleb, "She has your eyes." He didn't look at it long. Just enough. Then he slid it back, closed the drawer, and let the darkness take him. Outside, the wind picked up again. But Ava was already asleep, curled in her bed, the bell still in her hand. And the mark on the stone, burned into her mind, glowed behind her eyes. The wind had changed. Ava could feel it in the way the dust moved, in the sudden stillness of the birds. The kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. That night, the moon was a thin white blade across the fields, and every shadow looked like it was hiding something. She'd spent the last 3 days tracing sounds. There was a pattern, a rhythm, a low, trembling noise that came only at night, just beneath the edge of hearing. It wasn't wind. It wasn't pipes. It was alive. It pulsed from somewhere underground, like breath through stone. She kept notes on scraps of cardboard, torn paper corners, the insides of cereal boxes. Simple markings, lines, arrows, circles. Her maps looked childish, almost random. But to Ava, they made sense. The echoes told her where to walk. The metallic tang in the air told her when she was close. It always pulled her back to one place, the shed, an old building behind the barn, forgotten, choked with weeds. Its lock rusted shut, its hinges fused. She stood there now, one hand resting on the corroded doorknob, the other clutching the bell Mrs. Dorsey had given her. The door was cold, not from the night air, but from something inside. She knelt down, pressing her ear to the wooden boards. There it was, a groan low and guttural. Then a shudder like iron dragging across stone. She pressed her fingers to the dirt. It was warm, no reason it should be. The night was freezing, her breath fogged in the air. She ran her fingers along the seams of the shed's foundation until she found it a hairline crack barely visible. She slipped a twig into the crevice, pried gently, and a corner of the panel gave way. Below it, darkness and stairs. The first time Ava descended the staircase, she didn't bring a flashlight. Only the bell and her mother's old hair ribbon, which she tied around her wrist like a charm. The steps creaked under her bare feet, old and soft. The smell hit her halfway down, chlorine, rotting metal. Something else, something sterile like a hospital long since abandoned. The darkness wasn't complete. There were emergency lights still working, dull red strips along the edges of the floor, flickering like dying embers. She stepped into the corridor, the cement slick beneath her toes. This wasn't a basement. This was a facility. She followed the hallway maps in her mind, overlapping like puzzle pieces. Doors lined the corridor, each marked with peeling numbers B03, B04, B05. Through the windows, empty rooms, cots, restraints, machines that no longer blinked. And then she reached B07. The door was different, heavy, burned along the edges. There was no window, only a small hatch at the bottom, barely big enough to pass food through. She knelt beside it, slid the hatch open, inside black, but not silent. There again the sound, not breathing exactly, but something like it. She didn't call out. She couldn't. Instead, she pressed her ear to the opening. Inside, something shifted. A hoof, a clank, then a quiet exhale. Deep, wounded. She pressed her hand to the steel. It was warm, and then a vibration beneath her palm, not loud, but strong, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The door was alive. She stayed like that for minutes, maybe hours. Her breath matched the rhythm, her fingers trembling, then footsteps. She froze, not loud, not close. Outside, above, but someone was there. She backed away from the door, heart pounding. The hallway suddenly seemed longer than before, the red lights dimmer. She ran, up the stairs, out through the shed, into the cold, Across the field, watching from behind a cluster of cottonwoods, stood a figure. Ragged coat, army boots, a long gray beard catching the moonlight. Ethan Granger. He'd been watching her for 3 nights now. Not out of suspicion, out of recognition. He knew the sound she'd been hearing. He'd heard it too, but he didn't approach. Not yet. He watched as she emerged from the shed, gasping knees covered in dirt, clutching a brass bell like it was sacred. She looked around, eyes sharp despite her silence. She knew someone was out there. Ethan stepped back into shadow. Another time. She had to find it on her own. The next morning, Ava didn't eat. She sat by the window, tracing the bell's chain through her fingers over and over like worry beads. Caleb watched her from the kitchen, sipping coffee, a twitch behind his left eye. "You were outside last night," he said flatly. She didn't react. "You left the front door open." Still nothing. He stood, approached, crouched beside her. She stiffened. He took the bell from her hand, held it up. "This from the neighbor." She nodded once. He turned it over in his fingers, then placed it back into her palm. "You don't need this," he said, but he was wrong. She needed it more than anything. That night, Ava went back, this time with a small flashlight stolen from the drawer under the sink. She didn't need a map. She remembered every turn. When she reached B07, she didn't stop at the hatch. She tried the handle, locked, but the keypad beside it still had power. She stared at it, thinking. Then instinct. She pressed 4 numbers, 2007. The year on Caleb's file folder. The light turned green. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. It was like stepping into a memory. The room was massive, far larger than it looked from the outside, and in the center, chained, wounded, breathing, was the horse. Midnight. He was real, not a dream, not a symbol. Real. His coat was jet black, streaked with soot and grime. His mane was matted, tangled with wires. Across his back, machinery. Metal nodes embedded into skin, connected to a device that no longer blinked. His legs were shackled. His eyes were open, and they found her instantly. Recognition, not fear. Ava stepped forward, shaking. The smell was overwhelming, burned hair, old blood rust. She reached out, his head lowered. The bell in her pocket rang once accidentally, and he flinched. But then he pressed his head against her hand. Heavy, solid, trembling. Her fingers traced the flame-shaped scar on his forehead. It was warm. Then something caught her eye. Across the room on the far wall, faint, barely visible in the flickering red light. A handprint, small, burned into the steel. She walked toward it. Her own hand trembled as she lifted it. Same size, same shape. She pressed her palm against it. The metal was hot. Tears welled in her eyes. Not sobs, not cries. Just water, just silence. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came. Only the breath between heartbreaks. Ethan Granger watched from above. He had accessed an old crawl space in the rafters, same one he used during the war games back when this place meant something else. He saw the girl, saw the horse, and saw the print on the wall. He closed his eyes. He remembered. Operation FireMark. The day they branded that animal. The day they buried the truth. He thought he'd forgotten. But watching Ava now, he remembered everything. Back inside, Ava turned. Midnight stood taller now, his eyes clearer. Something had changed. They both knew it. But neither moved. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They just breathed. Together. Alive. The kitchen table had become a battlefield. Not with words. Not with raised voices. That would have been simpler. No, this war lived in silence, in the way Caleb's eyes lingered too long on Ava's drawings, in the way her fingers paused a fraction of a second before turning a page, in the way the bell never rang anymore. It started with the sketchbook. She'd left it open on the armrest, just for a moment, while she stepped outside to refill the water trough. Caleb hadn't meant to look, or so he told himself. But the image caught his eye like a nail under skin. A horse, black, coated in shadow, trembling under chains. Eyes that screamed without sound. On its forehead ablaze, a ragged flame that seemed to glow even in pencil. He turned the page. Another sketch, the same horse. But this time its back was wired to something. A machine tubes. The lines were frantic, angry, not childlike. He turned again. Now there was a shadow behind the horse. Not fully drawn. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, standing in the background, watching. The horse was trying to run. The shadow held something in its hands. He didn't have to guess who it was meant to be. He closed the book, didn't put it back where he found it. Instead, he carried it into the study, placed it under a folder labeled Post-Active Intel Level 4 Projects, and sat down without turning the light on. For a long time, he just stared at the wall. That night, Caleb waited until Ava was asleep. He walked past her room. The door was closed, the gap beneath it dark. No movement, no sound. He went into the storage room, second door on the left, where the old cameras were kept. Most were disconnected. Some still worked. He pulled one from the shelf, an obsolete field monitor wired into a handheld receiver. He powered it up, punched in the codes he thought he'd long since forgotten. The screen blinked, then static, then hallway feeds, old but intact. He flipped through them, one by one, until he found it. Camera 07B. It showed the sub-basement, the same hallway she must have walked through. The lights flickered red in the distance. There in the far left of the frame, something moved. A shadow. Small. Careful, Ava. He watched as she crept past the doors, paused at B07, touched the handle, and entered. He dropped the receiver. It clattered against the desk screen, shattering in a spiderweb pattern. He sat back, hands trembling. She knew. She'd found it. Later in the barn, he stared at the paddock gates, empty, dust-coated. No horses in a decade. No use for them. But that wasn't true, was it? They had one. Underground. Still breathing. Still wired. Still part of a program that was never supposed to exist. Silent Courier. A project designed to store and transport live data through biological vessels, specifically equines, chosen for their durability and movement patterns across difficult terrain. He remembered the briefings. He remembered the trials. And he remembered the girl, her mother, Isabel. She had tried to shut it down, tried to expose it, and had died in the process. He hadn't been the one to pull the trigger. But he'd been in the room when the decision was made. For the mission. That was the phrase. Always. But missions changed. People didn't. And now that girl, Isabel's girl, was in his house drawing shadows he'd spent years burying. In her room, Ava couldn't sleep. She sat with her knees tucked under her chin, staring at the drawing she'd just finished. Midnight again. But this time, something different. In the corner, barely visible, was a figure. A man, standing behind the horse. One hand outstretched, the other holding a brand. The brand wasn't touching the horse. Not yet. But it would. She took a piece of charcoal and darkened the eyes of the man until they disappeared entirely. Then her fingers began to tremble. She dropped the charcoal. The sound it made on the wood floor was too loud. Everything suddenly felt too loud. She curled under her blanket, pulling it over her head. From deep inside the covers, she listened. A breath. Or was it her own? Another. Faster. Thick. Not human. Was it his? Was it Midnight's? She couldn't tell anymore. She covered her ears. But the breathing didn't stop. Caleb couldn't look at himself in the mirror the next morning. He stood at the sink, fingers clenching the edge of the porcelain water running until it went cold. His reflection looked older, weaker. Not the soldier he remembered. Just a man unraveling. He dried his hands and opened a drawer. Inside an envelope, marked Silent Courier, Contingency Protocol. He stared at it. Didn't open it. Didn't need to. He knew what it said. Destroy the asset. Erase the data. And if necessary, remove the witness. He closed the drawer. Outside, Ava was digging again, not far from the field where she'd found the fire-marked stone. Her fingers were scraped nails dirty. But she kept going. She was looking for something. She didn't know what, but she knew it was there. Mrs. Dorsey passed by the fence line, gave a slow wave. Ava waved back, then pointed to the dirt, made a digging motion. Mrs. Dorsey tilted her head, confused, then nodded, gave a thumbs up, walked away. But she'd seen something. A flicker behind Ava, a shadow in the shed, watching. That night, Ava locked her door for the first time. Not because of the wind, not because of the barn, because of Caleb. She'd seen it in his eyes, the way he watched her hands, the way his fingers hovered near the drawer he never opened when she was around. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but she was aware, and that awareness hummed louder than the wind outside. She drew again. Midnight, but this time no chains, just the flame on his head. And behind him, a girl, holding a bell. The sound of breathing returned, but this time it was hers, and it was steady. In the dark down below, Midnight waited. His sides rose and fell, his ears twitched, and in his chest something flickered. A memory, not his, not exactly, but something planted, something stolen. A voice, a woman, singing, and a girl laughing. Then fire, then pain, then silence. Midnight breathed in, and the walls around him breathed with him. Above the man and the girl circled each other like wolves, and in between them, a truth wrapped in silence, waiting to be heard. Moonlight poured through the cracks in the barn like silver fire. It spilled across the field, over the rocks, over the weeds, painting everything in pale white. Ava moved without sound, barefoot, determined. The bell dangled from her fingers, silent until she chose otherwise. In her other hand, a small garden spade stolen from the tool shed. She had wrapped the handle in her shirt to muffle the sound. She wasn't sneaking. She was returning, down into the dark, back to the breathing, back to him. She moved faster this time, the stairs familiar, now the corridor less haunting. As if each visit scrubbed away the fear, left only purpose. When she reached the door to room B07, she paused. Her fingers trembled on the keypad, not out of fear, out of urgency. She pressed the code 207. The light flickered green. The door hissed, opened. Midnight stood in the same place, but different. His head snapped up at the light. His nostrils flared. His ears pinned back. He had sensed her even before the door opened, before the air changed. She stepped inside and lifted the bell. Ding, a small sound, but it echoed like thunder. The horse twitched. Then he reared. Chains pulled taut. The wounds at his haunches tore slightly, but he didn't scream. He growled, a low primal sound that shook the walls. His eyes glowed, not metaphorically. Reflections of moonlight caught the thin membrane over his pupils. They looked like they were burning. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, slow, steady. Then she knelt, removed the bandage from her index finger. It peeled away with a soft hiss, revealing raw skin, a half-healed cut from days ago. Without hesitation, she bit down. The taste was metallic. Her own blood trickled over her knuckle. She stood and walked to the far wall, stared at the gray, stained metal for a long moment. Then in small, shaking strokes began to write, one letter at a time. Freedom. Her finger dragged across the wall, smearing red into steel. The letters weren't perfect. They didn't have to be. They just had to be true. When she was done, she turned back to Midnight. The horse was staring at her, head low, breathing fast, and then he stomped once, a warning. She understood. She walked to the wall where the main lock system held the chains together. It was mechanical, old. She drove the spade into the bolt latch, once, twice. On the third strike, it cracked. A hiss of pressure escaped. Metal groaned. Midnight lurched. The chains rattled. Ava shoved the spade deeper. It caught, snapped the final pin, and then, with a scream so raw it could only come from something half man, half memory, Midnight broke free. He reared violently, wires whipping loose from his spine, fragments of glass shattering as he stomped. The floor vibrated. The machine sparked and died. The red lights overhead burst, plunging the room into momentary black. Upstairs in the study, Caleb looked up from his folder. Then, boom! A thud shook the foundation. He bolted from his chair. Downstairs, the hallway lights flickered. Ava stood her back to the open doorway, staring into the storm that Midnight had become. But he didn't charge her. He turned, faced the corridor, felt the fresh air, and took one step forward. Then another. His hooves sparked against the metal. He was free, but not gone. Not yet. A sound. Boots. Caleb. He emerged at the top of the stairwell, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other. Ava. He shouted, his voice cracking against the concrete. She turned, stepped into the light, between him and Midnight. Her hands rose slightly, not in surrender, not in fear, in defiance, in protection. She said nothing. Didn't need to. Her silence screamed. Caleb's flashlight caught the blood smear on her finger, the word on the wall. His eyes flicked to the broken chain lock, then to the horse. Midnight was crouched like a loaded spring body, coiled blood dripping from his flanks. Caleb raised the gun. Ava didn't move. The light caught her eyes. They were calm, wider than they should have been, older than he remembered. The two stared across the space, the light between them pulsing with tension. Caleb's grip trembled, not from weakness, from uncertainty. He could pull the trigger, could end it, complete the protocol, maintain the silence, the mission. But Ava's eyes didn't blink, and something cracked in him. Not bone, something deeper. He lowered the gun an inch. Just as, bang, the sound tore through the corridor. Not from Caleb, from behind, from above. A shot fired into the ceiling. Echoes, and then a voice, gravelly, sharp. Don't you dare, Thorne. Ethan Granger stepped into the light. His rifle was still raised. Smoke curled from the barrel. His boots scraped the floor like sandpaper on bone. "She's right," he said. "That thing behind her, it ain't your enemy." Caleb spun. "You followed us. I built this place." Ethan snarled. "I followed myself. You don't know what that horse carries?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I know he ain't a courier anymore. He's a witness. A beat." Then, same as her, the word hung. "Witness." Caleb's shoulders dropped an inch. Then another. His arm lowered fully. He stared at Ava again. Her fingers still trembled, but her feet held ground. Midnight stepped forward, pressed his head to her shoulder. And for the first time, she moved, climbed onto his back. No saddle, no rope, just skin and fire and trust. Ethan didn't stop her. Caleb didn't move. Midnight turned toward the corridor, toward the barn above, and ran. The explosion of motion shattered the silence. Midnight tore through the upper doors, Ava clinging to his mane. Her face streaked with sweat and dust. The barn door exploded outward in a burst of splinters and heat. Outside, the fields burned. Someone had lit a perimeter fire. The sky was orange. The wind carried smoke and cinder, but Midnight didn't stop. He plunged through the fire, hooves sparking, tail whipping flame. Ava ducked low. The bell on her wrist clanged wildly. Behind them, Caleb emerged, gun-lowered breath, gaunt knees half bent, like the weight of all his years had just caught up with him. Ethan stepped beside him. "You gonna chase her?" Caleb didn't answer, just watched as the black horse and the red sky swallowed the girl whole. A silhouette against fire, disappearing into freedom. And for the first time since the war, Caleb Thorne sat down and wept. The fire rose like a second dawn. Midnight's hooves cut through the dry field sparks, flaring with every strike against stone and root. Behind them the hills glowed an unnatural spreading flame, born from the ruptured gas lines that Caleb had triggered like a silent hunter, setting the world ablaze. Ava clung to Midnight's mane, her face streaked with ash, and Tears' eyes stinging, but wide open. She didn't look back, not even once. The bell on her wrist rang wildly, with each leap like a tiny war cry against the blaze chasing her. The night had become a gauntlet. The field once full of wheat and dust was now a hellscape, gas flames hissing from underground vents like dragons waking from slumber. The sky pulsed in orange and blood-red rhythms. A pipe burst 20 yards behind them, flinging dirt and fire skyward. Midnight swerved hard, his muscles a coiled machine of purpose and pain. Ava didn't scream. She couldn't. She held tighter, pressing her face to his neck, and the thudding of his heart filled her ears like a battle drum. Then, like a miracle torn from memory, there it was. A cabin, barely visible through the smoke, standing crooked at the edge of the sandstone ridge. Midnight slowed hooves skidding across scorched earth. The fire hadn't reached the ridge yet. The stone protected the perimeter. They had a few minutes, maybe less. Ava jumped down before he fully stopped. Her knees buckled, legs numb from the ride, but she didn't fall. The bell on her wrist spun one last time and settled. Midnight snorted beside her, flanks heaving. She turned to the cabin. Half of it had collapsed. The roof was caved in on one side. Tools rusted across the porch. Ivy strangled the chimney. The door was missing. But something about it felt known. She stepped inside. It was dark, cold despite the fire behind her. The air held the scent of old paper's oil and faintly lavender. A candle flickered. A man's silhouette rose from the back corner. Ethan Granger. He was already lighting a second candle, setting it beside a box of medical instruments laid neatly on a steel tray. "You made it," he said softly. Ava nodded once. Midnight stood at the threshold, refusing to enter. Ethan looked at him, then back at her. "He remembers?" Ava stepped toward the tray, eyes falling on the tools. Scalpels, syringes, a nameplate half rusted over. Isabel Reed, DVM, her mother's name. Her legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees. Ethan moved quickly, but gently, crouching beside her, laying a rough hand on her shoulder. "She worked here," he said, "long before you were born. This place, it wasn't always a hiding spot. It was a sanctuary." Ava blinked hard, tears threatening. Ethan's voice thickened. "Your mother was the one who taught me to read a wound like it told a story. She believed every animal carried a soul and a memory. The military didn't want souls. They wanted vessels." He stood, walked toward a locked chest, and opened it. Inside folders, tapes, old surveillance photographs. He pulled out a Polaroid, faded, grainy. Isabel Young, wild hair, tied back, smiling beside a horse, the flame mark barely visible. That was the first prototype. They said it was just telemetry, data storage, GPS. But she found more. Brainwave echo imprints, memory fragments. Ava stared. Ethan continued, voice lower now. When she tried to report it, file a formal inquiry, they silenced her. Made it look like an accident. I was in the Jeep behind her. I saw the impact. He paused. She didn't die instantly. She pulled you from the car before she passed out. You were still strapped in the back seat, humming something. Ava's lips parted. No sound. Caleb was there too, Ethan whispered. He followed orders. But I saw what it did to him. He volunteered to adopt you after the program was shuttered. Maybe guilt, maybe duty. He sat down slowly across from her. You were in the passenger seat when it happened, Ava. You watched the whole thing. That's why. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't have to. Ava's breath hitched. Her body shook quiet as a leaf twisting in the wind. And then, a sound, barely audible, a whisper. A breath scraped into syllables. Me. It escaped her mouth like a ghost, finding its way back into the world. Her eyes widened. So did Ethan's. She gasped. Not from pain, from relief. The room stilled. Even midnight seemed to lower his head at the door. One word. But it cracked the world open. She said it again. Louder this time. Me. And then she began to sob, not like a child, but like a dam collapsing. Years of silence, of pressure, of swallowed screams came pouring out. She curled forward, arms around herself, and wept into the floor. Ethan reached for a blanket, wrapped it around her. He didn't tell her to stop. Didn't say it would be okay. He let it happen. He let her break. Because sometimes healing only begins in pieces. Outside, the fire edged closer. Midnight pawed at the dirt, restless. Inside, Ava wiped her face. Red-eyed, open, stronger. Ethan stood again, took a folder from the chest. This, he said, handing it to her, is everything she documented. Biometrics, protest letters, internal correspondences, all copied in secret. Ava held it like scripture. She wanted the truth out, he said. And now, you're the only one who can carry it. She looked at the folder, then at the horse. Midnight met her eyes. A breath passed between them. The wind shifted. The bell on her wrist gave a soft, single chime. She nodded once. The fire wouldn't stop itself, but stories, when told, had a way of becoming water. The tracker chirped once, then again. A red dot pulsed on Caleb's handheld screen, weaving across the digital map like a pulse heading north by northwest toward the canyon shelf that held the old cabin. His boots crunched over scorched grass. The night behind him still smoldered. His shirt was soaked with sweat and ash. The wind howled through the valley like an omen. He moved with the muscle memory of a soldier. But tonight, he was chasing ghosts. The tracker embedded in Midnight's hind leg was one of the earliest prototypes, meant to be undetectable, inactive, unless activated by specific biometric triggers. Ava had triggered it. Her blood, her voice, her defiance. He climbed the ridge with a rifle strapped to his back and an ache in his chest that no morphine could dull. The closer he got, the harder it was to tell if the shaking in his hands was from exhaustion or regret. Then through the brush he saw it. The cabin, the silhouette of the girl beside the horse, and the old man at the door. Ethan. Caleb exhaled and stepped into the clearing. The sound of boots striking stone made Ava jerk upright. Midnight twitched, nostrils flaring. Ethan stepped in front of her. Then Caleb emerged, face gaunt, rifle loose at his side. He didn't raise it. Not yet. You tracked us, Ethan said. Caleb didn't answer. He looked at the girl. Her hands were wrapped around the folder, Isabel's folder, clutching it like a heartbeat. His eyes flicked to the horse. You activated the memory loop, he said flatly. Ava didn't move. She didn't mean to. Ethan replied. She doesn't understand what she's carrying. I think she understands more than either of us. Silence. Then Caleb took one slow step forward. I need the data, he said. Give me the horse. Ethan shifted. You'll kill it. Better that than what happens if it leaks. There are people who, I don't care what they want. Ethan snapped. I buried too much already. A long pause. Then Caleb dropped his pack. Unclipped the rifle. I'm not asking again. Ethan stepped back slightly, just enough to show the knife in his belt. They stood, two soldiers, two pasts, two unfinished stories. Inside, Ava crouched beside Midnight. He was calm, too calm, like he knew. His breath was warm against her neck. She looked into his eyes. reflections of fire, of pain, of her. Her hands trembled, then stilled. She placed her forehead against his and whispered, "Go." Midnight's ears flicked. Then he pulled back, turned, and charged through the door. Outside, Caleb caught movement in his periphery. He turned, but too late. Midnight burst through the porch boards, exploding beneath his hooves, the tracker chirping wildly now. He galloped past Caleb, eyes wide, mane aflame in moonlight. Caleb spun, aimed. Crack! The shot rang out into the night. Missed. Midnight vanished into the tree line, swallowed by wind and dark. Caleb lowered the rifle, breathed hard. Then, slam! Ethan tackled him from behind. The two hit the dirt, hard fists flying, years of repressed guilt colliding in bone and breath. Caleb struck first, elbow to chin. Ethan rolled, swung a boot to the ribs. The rifle flew into the brush. "I trusted you," Ethan growled. "She was supposed to be safe," Caleb snapped back. "You made her a variable." Caleb's hands wrapped around Ethan's throat, then paused. A glint steel. Ethan held the knife to his ribs. Breathless eyes locked. "Don't," Ethan whispered. "Not for them." Caleb's grip loosened. He rolled off, gasping. Blood dripped from his lip. Ava stepped from the cabin, holding the folder tight to her chest. She walked to Ethan, touched his shoulder, then extended the folder, offered it. Ethan blinked. "You sure?" She nodded once, eyes steady. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out the bell, held it up, and shook it once. Ding. Ethan looked from the bell to her, to the fire behind her, to the man collapsed on the ground beside them, then back to the folder. He took it, folded it into his jacket, and said nothing. Just a single nod, a promise. Caleb sat up slowly. His shoulder was bleeding from a jagged scrape. He looked at Ava, not as an enemy, not as a liability, but as something he had long forgotten how to see. A witness. She stepped toward him, kneeled. Their eyes met. He opened his mouth, but no words came, only tears. She reached out, took his hand. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. Midnight ran. Through the canyons, up the ridgeline. The tracker beeped, then sparked, shorted, died. He kept going. Above him, the stars thickened. The flame mark on his head glowed under starlight, then dimmed, transformed, became indistinguishable from the sky, like a falling star melting into the dark. Down below, Caleb stood alone in the clearing. Ash rained like snow. He watched the sky, eyes, glassy mouth open, and then he saw it. The faintest streak across the firmament. Not a horse, not a memory, just light, moving forward. Free. The world shifted when the files went public. Ethan didn't walk into a newsroom or hand them over to government officials he knew wouldn't listen. He uploaded the files from a signal-boosted transmitter wired into a laptop older than most war records, patched through encrypted lines, borrowed from his time under Black Ops. At 2:17 a.m., the entire archive, videos, transcripts, medical scans, voice recordings hit the public grid. By morning, chaos had bloomed. Major networks scrambled. Headlines screamed. Biological memory harnessing program exposed. U.S. military used living animals as data vessels. Child witness breaks years of silence. Photos of Ava's drawings, those frantic, soulful depictions of the horse in chains of the dark figure behind, splashed across international news. Her name was never released, but the art became an emblem. Protests erupted in front of veterans' hospitals, outside military research facilities. Former soldiers stepped forward, sharing whispers of strange experiments of units that vanished, of rumors that no one ever believed. Within 72 hours, an independent international tribunal was formed, and somewhere deep in Utah, Ava sat alone in a room lined with white. The psychiatric hospital was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that forgets children speak in silences louder than screams. Ava sat on the bed, knees to chest, her sketchpad closed beside her. She hadn't drawn in days. Not since the fire. Not since the cabin. Not since the man who raised her looked at her not as property or protocol, but as pain. A nurse peeked in, smiled softly. Ava nodded, but her eyes didn't move. A team of psychologists reviewed her files. Selective mutism, they said. Chronic trauma reactivation. They scheduled her for observation. Routine, sterile, predictable. But Ava said nothing. Not until the social worker, kind-eyed and too young, asked, "If we could send you anywhere, where would you want to go?" Ava looked up. No hesitation. She whispered, "Home." Home was no longer the same house. The charred wreckage of the barn was now an outline on the ground. The cabin had been cleared secured. The ridge was fenced partly to keep animals safe, partly to keep people out. But the field, the open coast that stretched out like a lung breathing under the sky, was untouched and waiting. Ethan met her there. Mrs. Dorsey came too. She stood beside Ava, at the edge of the field, her scarf fluttering against her throat where her vocal cords once were. Ava looked up at her, unsure. Mrs. Dorsey smiled, then pointed to the bell, lifted one finger, tapped it gently, and brought that finger to her chest. Ava's lip quivered. She reached up, held the bell still, then whispered, barely audible, "I'm still here." Mrs. Dorsey pulled her into an embrace, tight, slow-weathered. The kind of hug that said, "You don't have to be fixed to be whole." The therapy program began small, just Ava, Ethan, and a mare named Clementine who had once panicked at any loud sound. But word spread. First came a woman named Lara, retired Army medic with tremors in her hands and memories in her lungs. She couldn't breathe out. Then James, ex-infantry, who hadn't touched grass in 3 years without seeing blood on it. Then Marcellus, then Kim, then 5 more after that. They didn't talk much, at first, but horses don't ask for words. They just wait, and so did Ava. She never called herself a healer. She never wore white or preached forgiveness. She just stood in the middle of the field, raised her arm, and the horses came, one by one, until they all followed. And the soldiers, they followed too. Months passed. One evening, just as the sun dipped into the far edge of the canyon, Ava walked to the center of the pasture bell, tied loosely around her wrist, her hands dusty, her hair longer now. The air shifted. Birds paused mid-flight, and then a sound, faint, like hooves on rock. She turned, and there he was. Midnight. He walked slowly through the tall grass, unbothered by the distant fence lines. His back unmarked, no wires, no chains. The flame-shaped mark on his forehead caught the last golden light of the day. Ava stepped forward. He didn't run. She raised her hand. He lowered his head. Their foreheads touched. No words, none needed. But the world for a moment breathed again. From afar, a journalist captured the image. It went viral within hours. No one knew the girl's name. No one needed to. She was just the silent rider. And behind her, a shadow of a horse stepping out of flame into peace. The land was no longer silent. It breathed. It listened. And it remembered. Ava stood beneath the sign that now crowned the gates of the rebuilt field FireMark, Equine Therapy and Trauma Healing Center. The letters were hand-carved, scorched slightly at the corners, as if time itself had signed its name. Below the name was a symbol, a horse's head in profile with a single streak of light running down from its forehead, midnight's mark. The flame, the wound that became a compass. She didn't like calling herself founder or director. That belonged to Ethan, who now spent most of his mornings rebuilding fences and pretending he wasn't watching her from the porch. But the truth was, every nail, every trough, every moment, it was hers. Born not from vision, but from survival. It began with 1 child, then 3, then 20. Some had lost parents to war. Some had survived accidents or watched things no child should witness. Others had simply gone quiet. The kind of quiet the world forgets how to hold. Ava understood them, not in language, but in shadow. The children never arrived with fanfare. They came the way pain always does. Sideways quiet, reluctant. Ava never greeted them with questions. Just a nod, a gesture, a hand extended toward the corral. Midnight always waited. Still untethered, still unbroken. He had become a symbol in the press. In whispers across therapy circles, the warhorse who carried memories no machine could read. But here on this land, under this sky, he was simply the gatekeeper. The first day each child arrived, Ava led them to the central circle. She knelt, rang the small bell tied to her wrist, once a tradition now, and waited. Midnight approached slowly, always at his own pace. He'd stop 2 feet in front of the child, drop his head just enough, and wait. Each one hesitated, then reached out and touched the flame mark. Some cried, some trembled, some simply closed their eyes. Every time it worked. It wasn't a miracle. It was memory. Inside the main lodge, articles lined the wall. Laminated clippings yellowing at the edges. One read, "The girl who didn't speak for 2 years, taught the world to listen without words." Another, "Where the war ended." A field in Utah and 1 horse that remembered everything. No names were used. Just symbols, the bell, The mark, the drawing Ava had once etched in blood across a wall, freedom. It had become their motto, printed above the fireplace in crooked iron-forged letters. One morning, as winter faded into early spring, a boy named Caleb, no relation, pure accident of fate, arrived with his aunt. He hadn't spoken since watching his brother drown in a frozen lake 6 months before. His fingers constantly twitched as if grasping something invisible. Ava met him at the path, kneeling, eye to eye. She didn't touch him. She simply turned, walked toward the pasture, and rang the bell. Midnight came, slower than usual. The boy froze at first, then stepped forward. At the last moment, just before his hand reached the flame mark, he whispered, "Please." It was the only word he said for 3 more weeks, but it was enough. Later that day, Ava sat by the porch as the sun dipped low. Ethan poured 2 mugs of tea, passing one to her without a word. She sipped slowly, her eyes on the horizon. "Another one cracked the silence today," he said softly. Ava nodded. "I don't know how you do it." She glanced at him, not smug, not amused, just present. "I remember what it was like," she said finally. Her voice still soft, but no longer brittle. "To feel like you'd disappeared from your own life." Ethan exhaled. "Midnight never left you." She looked out across the pasture. The horse stood beneath the old cedar tree, moonlight lacing his back. The flame on his forehead shimmered faintly, as though reflecting a light no one else could see. "He didn't leave any of us," she whispered. A storm rolled in 2 nights later. Not lightning, but wind, ripping across the plains. The children gathered in the main hall. Some wide-eyed, others, braver now. Ava lit candles around the room, the scent of sage and cedar softening the edges of fear. One girl, Eliza, 7 deaf since birth, tapped Ava's wrist and signed a single phrase. "Is Midnight scared?" Ava knelt, took Eliza's small hand, led her outside. Together they walked into the wind. The trees howled, the grass bent, but Midnight stood still. They approached. The girl touched the mark on his head. A gust tore through the pasture, lifting her hair, but she smiled and signed again. "He's not scared." Ava nodded. And for the first time, Eliza signed something Ava didn't recognize. She tilted her head. Eliza pointed to Ava's chest, then to her own, then to the bell, and finally touched the flame mark again. No one translated it. It didn't need translation. It was hope. By late spring, FireMark had its own waiting list. Families drove from 5 states away. Word-of-mouth therapists recommended it as a last stop, a strange miracle between trauma and grace. Ava didn't rush anyone. She never forced curriculum. Some children never spoke. Some never needed to. The healing was in the presence, not the progress. She started a journal, not of words, but sketches. Each child she drew. In the margins, Midnight's flame would appear sometimes in the eyes, sometimes as a crown, sometimes floating like a star above the child's hand. When Ethan saw the drawings, he cried. "I think he said one day, Midnight's not the guide." Ava looked up. "You are." She didn't argue. She just looked back out the window. At the fields, where a horse once burned, and now led lost souls home. The prison wasn't far, an hour south of the FireMark pasture. Medium security. Gray walls, wire fence, one tree struggling to grow beside the rec yard, as if it too had been sentenced. Caleb refused a lawyer. He didn't fight the charges. Obstruction, endangerment, misconduct, conspiracy. The files Ethan had leaked had ensured full exposure. There was no hiding now. No protocol to retreat into. No uniform to wear like armor. He never asked for visitation, never called, and never mentioned Ava. Until the day Ethan Granger walked in. They sat across from each other in the visitation room. Just a battered table, 2 chairs bolted to the floor, and the sound of a fan that coughed every 30 seconds. Ethan wore a worn denim jacket. Caleb wore state-issue beige. He looked older, but less haunted. Like the masks had finally peeled away, and underneath was just a man. "Didn't think you'd come," Caleb said. Ethan shrugged. "Didn't think you'd last this long." Silence. Then Ethan leaned in slightly. "You were a protector once," he said. "You were trained to watch, to shield, to survive. But somewhere along the line, you mistook silence for safety." Caleb looked away. "You're not a monster," Ethan continued. "Just a man who followed orders until he forgot how to disobey them. But the worst kind of silence," he paused, "is when you stop listening to yourself. Caleb said nothing for a long time. Then, barely above a breath, she made me feel human again. The next day, a letter arrived at FireMark. Not typed, handwritten, neat, military cursive, folded in thirds addressed only to Miss Ava. She opened it alone, seated beneath the oak where she first rode midnight bareback. The wind teased the edges as she read. Ava, I've rehearsed this in my head 1,000 times. I used to believe silence was control. That if I didn't say it, it couldn't hurt me or you. But silence became a bunker. And you were the only person who ever walked into it without fear. I was not a father. I was a custodian of secrets. I didn't know how to love. But you taught me that silence isn't forgetting. It's waiting. And sometimes waiting becomes listening. I am listening now. I am sorry. Caleb. She didn't cry. She folded the letter slowly, pressed it to her chest once, then tied the ribbon of the envelope to the bell on her wrist. Later that evening, as golden light smeared the field, she stood at the barn doors. Children gathered around. A new boy, Jonas, ate silent since the fire that took his twin clung to her sleeve. Ava crouched, took his hand, led him to midnight, mounted gently, then reached down. Jonas hesitated. She nodded once. He climbed up behind her. The others watched in breathless hush. She rang the bell once, just once, and they rode. Slowly at first, then faster. Midnight galloped across the field, wind lifting Ava's hair, the ribbon from the letter, trailing like a banner behind them. Jonas held tighter. Ava leaned into the rhythm of hooves, of breath, of memory. She didn't look back. The past had hurt her. Now it could rest. She didn't speak. She never did. Not when the mayor handed her the microphone. Not when the governor clapped twice too loudly and tried to smile down at her. Not even when the camera crews angled in close, searching for the first words from the girl who had redefined what it meant to listen. Ava stood still, 10 years old now, in a field surrounded by over 200 children. Every one of them bore a different scar. Some wore hearing aids. Some carried burns behind their sleeves. Some simply looked down at their shoes as if afraid that even eye contact could open old wounds. Behind her, the new FireMark Center towered not in size, but in meaning. Stone and cedarwood, hand-built by veterans and survivors, carved with symbols of the past, a bell, a flame, a horse's profile. A new sanctuary for those who had known silence, not as peace, but as exile. Ava breathed deep, then lifted her hand, not to wave, not to command, but to open. A single motion. Palm up, fingers wide. From the far end of the pasture, a shape stirred. The children turned. Gasps whispered through the crowd. The camera crews froze. Midnight emerged. No bridle, no saddle, no chains. He moved like a ripple through dusk hooves, silent mane long. The faint shimmer of silver dust on his back like a second skin. His flame mark glowed softly in the dying light, pulsing like the heartbeat of the land itself. He didn't gallop. He didn't need to. Midnight walked directly toward Ava, his breath slow, deliberate. Then he bowed. His head dipped nose to earth, a gesture older than speech, older than history. One by one, the children moved forward. No one directed them. They just knew. The first was a girl with an eye patch. She stepped to Midnight, hand trembling, and pressed her fingers against the flame mark. The horse didn't flinch. Then came a boy in a wheelchair, pushed gently by his older brother. He leaned forward, forehead resting against Midnight's mane. For a moment he smiled. Then tears. A teenager with a stutter. A refugee child with no parents. A girl who hadn't walked indoors for 6 months. Each approached. Each touched the mark. Each left something behind, fear, grief, memory, and took something else in return. Not words, not healing, but understanding. As the last child stepped back into the circle, the light changed. Utah's sky caught fire in a way only Utah's sky could, veins of molten gold threading through lavender clouds, then melting into a deep cobalt. It was the kind of sunset that made people believe in something bigger, even if only for a moment. Then came the lanterns. Thousands, handmade, colored with drawings and symbols, letters never sent. They floated up from behind the barn, carried by families, teachers, neighbors, strangers. Some rose with flickers, some blazed. Each one bore a silent prayer, each one a voice, each one a name, a wound, a hope. They rose in waves, lifting into the twilight, climbing higher and higher, until the field glowed like a cathedral of air and light. The children tilted their heads back. Even the most solemn among them cracked smiles. And Ava, she stepped back from midnight, turned, looked at them all. Her hand reached toward her chest, laid flat, then pressed softly, and stayed. No one spoke. No one moved. The lanterns rose, the horse exhaled, and somewhere far behind the sky, someone might have sworn they heard it. A bell, soft, pure, ringing not from metal, but from memory. Later, after the lights had dimmed and the crowd had slowly dispersed, Ava sat on the porch, barefoot legs swinging. Her dress was stained from dust and joy. In her lap, a tiny bundle new sketches fresh from the hands of children who had rediscovered art or safety, or both. Ethan sat beside her, a blanket over his knees, silent. The air carried the scent of smoke and sage and sun-warmed wood. Midnight stood by the fence, still watching, always. Ava reached down into her pocket, pulled out a bell, not the old one. This one was carved from olive wood, gifted by a boy from Palestine who hadn't spoken in 2 years before FireMark. She rang it once, not for the past, but for the present, and for what might come next. Miles away, in a prison library, Caleb Thorne closed his journal and looked out the window. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't pray for release. But he had begun to speak again, to himself, and sometimes that was enough. By spring, FireMark had a sister center in Colorado. By autumn, there were whispers of one in rural Japan. And by winter, Ava's story had reached classrooms, hospitals, and war zones, not through her voice, but through the mark. Teachers drew it in chalk on blackboards. Therapists printed it on worksheets. Soldiers tattooed it on their arms before deployment. A simple flame between 2 ears. A symbol for freedom, for silence, for everything in between. But Ava never gave speeches. She never claimed credit. She just rode across the field with a child behind her, always just one, always holding on, always heading toward the wind. The final image, a slow rising shot. Ava and a young girl bawled from chemo, wide-eyed on midnight's back, riding through grass that glowed like gold. Lanterns above, mountains behind. The bell tied to Ava's wrist, catching one last slant of sun, and ringing once, then silence. Not empty, not heavy, just enough.